higher in the drug-treated group. Second confirming study. And then we had the Soteria study, which was done, of course, by Loren Mosher, which was a randomized study. It was meant to study this question. He randomized one group into a drug-treated arm. The other patients were randomized into Soteria House, which was a place where drugs were used in a minimal fashion as last resort. Guess who did better? The placebo-treated patients. Once again, he saw higher relapse rates in the drug-treated patients. Now, in 1979, Will Carpenter actually crystallized the question. He said, we have this paradox. Yes, it seems these drugs are effective in dampening down psychosis over the short term, but are we in fact increasing the biological vulnerability to psychosis with this form of care? So he raised this very profound question. And all the evidence was showing yes, indeed. And probably if you look at this, if you want to measure the benefit of a form of treatment, you have to have some sense of what is the natural spectrum of outcomes for people diagnosed with schizophrenia. Well, we really don't know that. We say it's a chronic illness. Once you get diagnosed, you're going to be ill for life. But there's no evidence to support that at all. What the evidence shows is that you have very heterogeneous spectrum of outcomes. And what we saw in every study is that at least 50% would get beyond their psychotic break and do well in extended follow-up periods. And then the question is, if you take that group that could do well, are you pushing them into chronic illness if you immediately put them on drugs and keep them on drugs? And that was the very strong evidence showing up in 1979 that at the very least, you're worsening outcomes for that 50%. Now, I want to add one other thing in terms of how we measure the value of drugs. When you talk about neuroleptics, we have over here a belief, of course, that at least they're dampening down this target symptom that's so distressing. Now, we know they have side effects, but you balance the benefits versus the risks. Well, we need something over here on the benefit side because we know all these risks are there to make this a worthwhile paradigm. But if we're seeing higher relapse rates, higher return of psychosis on the drug-treated groups, what's left on the benefit side? On the whole, on the aggregate? Even that comes on now on the negative side. And all of a sudden you see basically a body of evidence saying that at least in the aggregate, you're doing more harm than good. That maybe you have some short-term benefit, but over the long term, in fact, you're pushing people towards a pattern of chronic illness. Now, I think you can make a rationale for some sort of selective use of the drugs, but based on that body of evidence up to that moment, you certainly don't have a rationale for drug everybody all the time, immediate neuroleptization. Now, at the same time that this was being done, there was investigation of the dopamine hypothesis that basically fit into and provided an explanation for why we were seeing this greater chronicity in drug-treated patients. And here's the story behind that. The way the dopamine hypothesis rose is we knew these standard neuroleptics, Thorazine, Haldol. How did they work? Well, they profoundly block dopamine activity in the brain. And one of the reasons we knew this is because, of course, patients giving the drug started developing Parkinson's symptoms, motor movement symptoms. Well, what is the cause of Parkinson's? Well, you get Parkinson's when you lose about 80% of your dopaminergic neurons in the basal ganglia. So it's a profound deficit of dopamine transmission in the brain. So if you're getting the same symptoms, clearly what you're doing with neuroleptics, standard neuroleptics, is basically producing the same deficiency in dopamine transmission. So the hypothesis was being, okay, we know these drugs block dopamine, but maybe the reason they work is that people have too much dopamine, people who get diagnosed with schizophrenia, and therefore maybe we're sort of balancing dopamine. Have too much, we knock it down, and that's where this idea came forward. So what do they do to investigate that hypothesis? Well, the first thing they do is they look for metabolites. This is breakdown of dopamine as it breaks down in the body, in the cerebrospinal fluid, the blood, and the urine. And they're going to look, if they see in schizophrenics, people so diagnosed, okay, I'm just using the labels that they use, if they have higher levels of metabolites in their blood. And you know, they reported, I think this was, I forget the year, 76 around, they said, we have found the cause of schizophrenia. It's too much dopamine, because indeed they had too many they had extra high levels of metabolites in their blood. And this was, I think, published in Nature. It was a big splash in the New York Times, cause of schizophrenia basically found. However, if you read that paper, the doctor said, you know, we don't know if this is due to the disorder or if this is due to the drugs. These are all drug-treated patients. So what did they do? They eventually did some other studies, and what they found was, prior to medication, you didn't see the extra metabolites. It was only after being put on the drugs that you saw the extra metabolites. Now, why would that be? Well, it's really a testament to the flexibility of the brain. You dampen down, you block the receptors for dopamine, profoundly so, and the brain goes, uh-oh, I'm in trouble. Because dopamine is such an important neurotransmitter, and it starts pumping out more dopamine. It's a compensatory mechanism. It lasts for at least 3-4 weeks, and that's why you were seeing the extra metabolites in the brain, in the blood, cerebrospinal fluid. So they said, okay, the brains of people so diagnosed aren't putting out too much dopamine, but maybe they have too many receptors for dopamine, and that's the problem. So they looked at that. Abnormal number of dopamine receptors, and that was it still fit in this idea of hyperactive dopamine systems. So at autopsy, they chop, whatever they do to do this, I guess they chop up the brains of people with schizophrenia, and again they announced, we found the cause of schizophrenia. It's too many dopamine receptors. And again it was announced in the New York Times, this is the biological abnormality that's the cause of schizophrenia. Again, you had to read the paper. Guess what they said in the paper? We don't know if this is the cause of the drug or if indeed it's related to the disorder. So what did they find? And this has been a bit of controversial research, but basically now they know the mechanism is indeed, you don't see it in unmedicated schizophrenics. And they've even been able now to measure the density of dopamine receptors in living people. And prior to medication, you don't see an abnormal number of dopamine receptors. But once they're put on the drugs, you do. Roughly 30–50%. Why? Because again, it's the drugs, it's the brain's mechanism for coping with that blocking of dopamine. So now all of a sudden what they've realized, and now they call it, it's interesting, when it was going to be the cause of schizophrenia, it was an abnormality that caused psychosis. But once they found the drugs caused it, they started talking about upregulating the dopamine receptors as if they were normalizing it. But anyway, the point of this is this. This idea of the physiology of what you were doing with the brain with neuroleptics became pretty complete by 1979. And there were researchers from Canadian University, from McGill University in Canada, who basically said, it looks like what we're doing, and the reason we see this excess relapse in people so drug-treated is because we have this change in the brain. We basically block dopamine, we end up with too many dopamine receptors, and that makes people more biologically vulnerable to psychosis and to even worse psychotic episodes. Now, in my opinion, at that time, 1979, you had this coalescing of information that, frankly, I think the medical establishment needed to respond to. Because again, they had nothing left over here in the aggregate as to why this was benefiting patients on the whole over the long term. We knew we had tardive dyskinesia, Parkinson's, emotional lethargy. A lot of patients didn't want the drugs. And we didn't even have over the long term, at least in the aggregate, a sense that it was knocking down psychosis. So we lost the rationale for the drugs. Again, at least as use for all people, all time. And at the very least, you had to come up with a paradigm of care, in my opinion, that would involve selective use of the drugs and the recognition that in these placebo studies, at least 50% or higher of the patients treated with placebo got better and didn't relapse in that time. Obviously, you have an obligation to those people to not push them down this chronic path. Now, do we have confirming evidence that indeed this paradigm of care is increasing the likelihood that a person who suffers a psychotic break, gets diagnosed with schizophrenia, will become chronically ill? Because that's basically what you're seeing, and it goes back to this original thing. Why are we getting more disabled people, unable to work, chronically ill? we have two forms, I think, of very powerful confirming evidence. One was the World Health Organization.